The engine caught fire at 4,000 meters.
13,000 feet. Alone. The canopy was jammed. Smoke, black, oil thick, filling the cockpit faster than she could think. She was 21 years old. The Yak 1 was burning. The ground was somewhere below, and the Messerschmitt that hit her was circling back to finish the job. She didn't eject. She didn't radio for help. She rolled the aircraft inverted, kicked the canopy loose with both feet, and fell into open sky. Her parachute opened at 300 meters, 984 feet. That's not a safe altitude. That's a prayer. Would you climb back into a cockpit after that? She did. The next morning. And here's the part that doesn't fit neatly into any story you've been told about this war. She wasn't an exception. She wasn't a propaganda stunt. She was a fighter pilot. One of the deadliest the Eastern Front ever produced. The Soviet Air Force didn't recruit her because they believed in equality. They recruited her because they were running out of men. In the next 12 minutes, we're going to trace how a girl from Moscow, a flying instructor who lied about her flight hours just to get into combat, became the first woman in history to shoot down an enemy aircraft in dogfighting combat. How she fell in love at 3,000 meters and watched that love burn on a runway. How she killed 12 men before her 22nd birthday. And how, on a summer afternoon in 1943, she flew into a cloud and never came out. But this isn't a hero story. Not really. It's about what the Eastern Front did to everyone it touched, especially the ones who were winning. By the summer of 1942, the Soviet Air Force was bleeding out. The Luftwaffe had destroyed over 7,500 Soviet aircraft in the first 6 months of Barbarossa, nearly 4,000 in the first 72 hours alone, most of them on the ground, some before their pilots had even woken up. What remained was a patchwork. Obsolete biplanes flying alongside newer fighters. Boys with 8 hours of training sent up against German aces with 200 kills. The average combat life expectancy for a Soviet fighter pilot in 1942 was 64 sorties. 64. That's not a career. That's a countdown. Stalin needed bodies, so Order 0099 was signed. 3 all-female aviation regiments were formed. 1 for bombers, 1 for night bombers, the famous Night Witches, and 1 for fighters, the 586th Fighter Aviation Regiment. Lydia Vladimirovna Litvyak arrived that spring.
She was 20 years old.
Blonde hair, she dyed with hydrogen peroxide from the military commissary, stood 5'3", weighed less than the engine of her aircraft. She'd been flying since she was 14. By 15, she was instructing. By 18, she'd trained 45 pilots, all of them men, most of them older than her. Her logbook showed 100 hours of flight time. The minimum requirement was 500. She lied, added the hours herself, forged the documentation. Nobody caught it. Within weeks, it was obvious she could fly better than pilots with twice her experience. She was assigned a Yak 1. Good plane, rugged, simple. But let's be honest about what she was up against. The German Messerschmitt Bf 109G could hit 640 kilometers per hour in level flight. The Yak struggled to reach 590. 50 kilometers per hour difference.
Doesn't sound like much.
But it meant the German could dictate every engagement. Dive, fire, climb away before the Yak could get its nose pointed in the right direction. The firepower disparity was worse. The German carried a 20mm cannon and 2 heavy machine guns. The Yak had 1 cannon, one machine gun, and less ammunition for both. But the Yak had one advantage. It could turn. If you could survive the first pass, if you could drag a German into a horizontal fight, a real dogfight, you could kill him. The problem was surviving long enough to get there. The 586th was initially assigned to rear area patrols, escorting transports, air defense over cities the Germans weren't bombing anymore, the kind of flying that keeps you alive and drives a fighter pilot insane. Litvyak wanted the front. She requested transfer repeatedly.
In September 1942,
She got her wish. She and 3 other women were reassigned to the 437th Fighter Aviation Regiment, an all-male unit operating near Stalingrad. You can imagine the reception. The regiment commander looked at them and saw liabilities. He protested the assignment. The ground crews were skeptical. The other pilots didn't bother hiding their contempt. But the Germans were crossing the Volga. The city was burning. Every plane had to fly. September 13th, 1942. Her second combat mission with the regiment. The sky over Stalingrad was black with smoke. Her flight was scrambled at 06:47 hours to intercept a formation of Junkers Ju-88 bombers with fighter escort. She was flying wingman. Her job was simple: protect the leader's tail. Then the formation shattered. Suddenly, she was alone with a bomber, massive target,
she closed to 200 meters.
point blank. One burst. The bomber's engine caught fire. It rolled and went down. But she wasn't done. ABF 109 was on her leader's tail. The German pilot was fixated. He didn't see the Yak climbing up from below. Litvyak pulled up and fired until her guns jammed. Smoke poured from the German's fuselage. He bailed out. 2 kills, 1 sortie. Her first real day of combat. When she landed, nobody believed her. A woman? Shooting down a Bf 109? The regimental commander demanded proof. The German pilot was captured. Decorated ace, 11 victories, Iron Cross on his chest. They brought him in for interrogation, and he demanded to see the pilot who'd bested him. He expected a grizzled veteran. They brought in a 21-year-old girl wiping oil off her hands. He laughed. He thought it was a Soviet joke. Then she described every turn of the fight, every mistake he made, the exact moment he'd lost her in his blind spot. The laughter stopped. The white lily appeared on her fuselage sometime that winter. Some accounts say a mechanic painted it, others say she did it herself. Either way, it became her signature and her death warrant. By late 1942, she'd been promoted to free hunter, elite status. It meant she didn't have to fly in rigid formation. She could roam. She could hunt. The Luftwaffe noticed. German pilots started reporting engagements with the White Flower. Intelligence compiled a file. By early 1943, there was a bounty on her head, an Iron Cross, and a promotion to whoever brought her down. She was flying 3, sometimes 4 sorties a day. The fatigue was building. You could see it in her flying.
She pressed attacks closer.
100 meters, 80 meters, ranges where a miss meant a collision. One of her wingmen described her flying in April 1943 as someone who had stopped calculating. That's not courage. That's erosion. Every pilot she'd trained with, flown with, fought beside, most of them were dead. The 64 sortie average was just math until you watched it happen to your friends. But then it got personal. Alexei Solomatin, fellow ace, hero of the Soviet Union. Dark hair, quick smile, the kind of confidence that comes from being genuinely good at something lethal. They'd met at the airfield, started flying together, fighting together. In the chaos of the front, in the mud and the blood and the endless sorties, they'd found something resembling a life, found something resembling love. May 21st, 1943.
Solomatin was training a new pilot.
A routine flight. His plane developed mechanical trouble on approach, loss of power, the engines stuttering. Litvyak was on the ground, watching from the edge of the runway. She watched his yak stall. She watched it spin. She watched it hit the ground and explode. She was the first one to the wreckage, running across the field while the smoke was still rising. She tried to pull him out. There was nothing left to pull out. She flew a combat mission the next day, shot down a Bf 109. It wasn't about duty anymore. It wasn't about survival or victory or the motherland. It was about rage. 2 months later, her best friend died, Katya Budanova, the only other woman who understood what this life was, the only one who'd been there from the beginning. July 19th, 1943. Shot down over the Donbass.
No parachute.
The reports don't say what Litvyak was feeling when she got the news. Reports never do. But the flight logs show she flew 2 sorties that day, alone. Engaged 4 enemy aircraft. Her mechanic, Ina Pasportnikova, begged her to rest. Litvyak shook her head. "I have to fly," she said. "If I stop, I'll go mad." The summer of 1943 brought Kursk, the largest tank battle in history. Above the burning armor, the air war reached a fever pitch. July was a blur, sortie after sortie. Litvyak was exhausted. She'd been wounded twice, crash-landed once, hospitalized and escaped back to the regiment before the doctors cleared her. She was running on adrenaline and hatred. July 16th. She went up alone, found a German formation. She attacked. One Yak 1 against a flight of Messerschmitts. She shot one down.
Another
Put holes in her fuselage. She nursed the crippled fighter back to base, belly landing in the grass. Her mechanic ran to the plane, begged her to stop. Litvyak climbed out of the cockpit and asked for a new aircraft. By the end of July, her count stood at 12 solo kills and 4 shared, the highest-scoring female ace in history, a record that still stands 80 years later. She was famous. Posters in Moscow, interviews in Pravda, the White Lily of Stalingrad. But fame doesn't stop bullets, and she was out of time. August 1st, 1943, Donbass region. The weather was heavy, low clouds, poor visibility. Litvyak sortied 4 times that morning, 4 times. Imagine the physical toll, the G-forces, the dehydration, the constant adrenaline-soaked terror that never quite fades between missions. On the 4th sortie, she was escorting IL-2 Sturmovix. Ground attack planes, slow, vulnerable, easy prey for fighters. They were jumped by Messerschmitts, 8 of them, maybe 12, diving out of the clouds. It was an ambush. The Soviet formation broke apart, radio calls overlapping, panicked, fragmented. "Contact, 3 o'clock high. I'm hit, I'm..." "White Lily, brake left, brake." Litvyak didn't run. She turned into them. She didn't have to. She could have dove away. The Sturmovix were the target, not her. But the bombers were sitting ducks, and she wasn't the kind of pilot who left people behind. She engaged a pair of Messerschmitts. Her wingman, Ivan Borisenko, lost sight of her in the clouds. When he found her again, her yak was trailing smoke, white smoke turning black. 8 German fighters circling. The plane dove toward the ground. Borisenko watched the canopy, waited for the parachute. Waited. Nothing. The aircraft disappeared into the haze near the village of Dmitrievka. Borisenko circled as long as his fuel allowed, calling her name over the radio. "Lilia 44! Lilia 44! Respond!" Static. "Lilia 44, please respond!" Static. She was 21 years old. The regiment searched for 3 days. They found wreckage scattered across 2 kilometers of farmland. Engine parts, wing fragments, pieces of propeller, but no aircraft, no body, no confirmation. And this is where tragedy turns into something worse. Because they couldn't find a body, Soviet command refused to list her as killed in action. They listed her as missing. In Stalin's Russia, that word meant something specific. Missing meant possibly captured,
Possibly defected.
possibly a traitor broadcasting propaganda for the Luftwaffe. None of it was true, but suspicion was enough. Her file was marked accordingly. Her name was removed from the list of heroes of the Soviet Union. Her mother received no death benefits. Her kill count was quietly erased from official records. Anna Vassilyevna, her mother, spent the next 40 years writing letters to military archives, begging to know what happened to her daughter. Every request was denied. The White Lily had vanished, and the state preferred to pretend she'd never existed. But Inna Pasportnikova, the mechanic who'd watched her fly, who'd patched her planes, who'd begged her to rest, refused to stop looking. 36 years. That's how long she searched. She wasn't military. She wasn't an academic. She was a woman with a metal detector and a shovel, combing the sunflower fields of Ukraine, interviewing villagers, cross-referencing incomplete records, walking crash sites with a hand-drawn map and a compass. In 1979, she found it, a shallow grave near Dmitrievka. The locals remembered burying an unknown pilot there in the summer of '43. They said the pilot was small, fair hair, a woman. The forensic examination took years. DNA testing wasn't available. They used dental records, personal effects, the location data Inna had spent decades assembling. The conclusion was definitive. Lydia Litvyak had died exactly where the ground observers said, in the sky over Dmitrievka, doing what she'd done 66 times before. She'd taken a 20mm shell to the cockpit. Death was instantaneous. She hadn't surrendered. She hadn't defected. She died fighting 8 men alone to protect her bombers. She was 21 years and 12 days old. On May 5, 1990, 47 years after her death, Mikhail Gorbachev signed a decree. Lydia Vladimirovna Litvyak was posthumously awarded the title Hero of the Soviet Union. The empire she died defending would collapse 18 months later. When they excavated her remains, there was one detail that didn't make the official reports. Among the rotted fabric and corroded aluminum mixed with the wreckage of her cockpit, they found a small metal object, a compact, makeup. She'd carried it on every mission, a reminder maybe, that underneath the flight suit, underneath the medals, underneath the kill count and the bounty and the legend, she was still a person. A person who dyed her hair with peroxide from the commissary, who kept wildflowers pressed in her cockpit, who fell in love at 3,000 meters and never recovered from watching it burn. A person who didn't want to die in a muddy field in Ukraine. The grave in Dmitrievka is quiet now. The yak one is long gone, rusted into the earth. Sunflowers grow where she fell. The soil is dark and rich, good for farming, good for burying things, But the record stands. 12 kills, 66 combat missions, shot down 3 times, wounded twice, 21 years old. For half a century, her own country couldn't decide if she was a hero or a traitor. It took a mechanic with a shovel to bring her home. The plane doesn't care who's pulling the stick. Gravity doesn't check your papers. A 20mm shell doesn't ask for identification. Lydia Litvyak figured that out before anyone was ready to admit it. She flew until her hands were blistered and her eyes were bloodshot. She flew until there was nothing left of herself to give. And when the state tried to erase her, one woman refused to let it happen. That's not a story about the past. That's a story about who gets remembered and why. About who decides which names go in the books and which ones get buried in sunflower fields. Some of you watching carry stories like this. A grandmother who served. A great-uncle who never came home. Letters in a box somewhere that nobody's opened in decades. If that's you, tell us in the comments. These stories don't survive on their own. They survive because someone passes them on. The files are still being declassified. The questions are still being asked. And we'll be here to keep asking them.